All right. Hey guys, what's happening? This is Luke with LukeHumphreyRunning.com. Today, we're going to jump into an article I think a fair number of people have seen talking about performance characteristics of higher performers in the marathon. And I just happened to come across another, not study, but a group of people who look at studies, and they made some commentary on this study. And I want to jump into that too. I want to get on board that train and give my 2 cents as well. So without further ado, I don't think it'd be too long today. First of all, I hope everybody had a good Thanksgiving, made it through, no drama, and lived to see another day. So in any case, if many of you have seen this study, it's looked at marathon, like I said, marathon characteristics, performance characteristics of people who were doing well in the marathon, faster versus slower times, right? And so this study looked at 917 participants of the Boston Marathon. I don't know what year. It ended up being 45% males and 55% females. It looked like the runners were defined as developmental level, which is interesting. But they averaged 9 years of training and had run 16 marathons. And these were all people who had qualified for Boston. And the interesting thing to this study, according to them, was that this was based on, they were looking at training data prior to the marathon versus after the fact. So there was less bias in what was being said. Usually studies like these are retrospective. So they've looked at it. They're looking at it past, beyond. So interesting in that aspect. And 917 people is a lot of people, and it's the Boston Marathon, so you have to assume that most people are going to be pretty fit going into that, right? But anyway, what they surveyed on, so the running part of it was the weekly hours that the person ran, weekly volume, total number of runs in hard sessions. And then from a cross training standpoint, they looked at weekly, air quotes, non-specific general training. And this could include anything from cycling, swimming, rowing, strength and conditioning. I'm assuming mobility might be in there, yoga, I'm sure all kinds of stuff in there. But so as you can tell in my voice, that's where I get hesitant on some of the stuff, right? Because I feel like that's a big umbrella of labeling something cross training. And so that would be my concern, as we'll talk about in a second here. But then they asked about change in habits. So back up a second here. So they asked these things in training regarding 2 points of time. So the period of 12 months up to 4 months before the marathon. And then the second period was 4 months to 4 months to 0 days out from the marathon. And so that's pretty interesting there. And then they asked about change in habits over those 2 time frames. And so it was the same setup, ask same things in running, cross training, all that good stuff, right? And then they compared the 2. And so the results showed that 50% of the differences in race times was accounted for by how often a person trained 12 to 4 months out, which would make sense, right? Like if you're not super consistent in training over a long period of time, you're going to see vastly different results. And then they also looked at, and it was also part of running distance, duration, number of sessions. Anyway, these all predicted the performance of the person. And so the better the performer, they found that it was 10 hours a week of training and quality sessions equaled better performances. So, if you follow us at all, you're probably in that 10-hour range of training, given everything you're doing. That's not just running, but that would be like, stretching, strength training, all that stuff. You're probably pretty close to 10 hours on that. So, but I found that interesting, to say the least. And then in terms of the 4 months to 0 months, what they found was that 36% of the time variance was determined by a change in frequency. And this is where this got crazy moment happens. And they said that decreases in training frequency led to faster performances. And so the takeaway that they gave in the study was that reduction training over the last 4 months equaled better performance. And that would say, and even the article I was reading in regards to the study kind of had some pushback on it, like, well, maybe not. And if you're interested in this was published in Sports Medicine September of 2025, if you want to look up that article. But in any case, I do not know. I don't think that's necessarily the case. I don't think I would draw that conclusion of training less over the last 16 weeks of a marathon is leading to faster performances, because just the way that it's set up, right? And what they determined that, how they determined that. But and overall, though, I would agree, like the 4 to 12 months out, like the more you can build that baseline volume up, the much better off you're going to be. And what do I mean by baseline volume? I mean, if right now you can go out and run 20 miles a week, no problem. That's what you do week in and week out. You can perform at a certain level. Now, if you can take some time and build that to 30 miles a week, doing that week in, week out, that's just what you do. I go run 5 miles a day, 6 times a week, or I go 6 miles a day, 5 times a week, whatever, doesn't matter. You're building that volume, that baseline volume up to 30 miles a week versus 20. Now you've established a new baseline in performance too. And from there, you can go to a new peak level, right? So if you're at 20 miles a week, maybe you can peak out at 30, 35 miles for a short period of time before you have to come back down to the 20. So the higher that baseline is going to allow you to have a higher and higher peak volume too. So it all will play into each other as you start into things like a marathon segment or something that's going to require significantly more mileage. And then also I would just say too, like the higher the baseline, you're 6 to 10 weeks away from really being able to perform pretty well at any level, because your baseline volume is already going to take you to a certain amount of fitness. Then you can do a pivot and you can go one direction or another, do the workouts you need to do for that over that 6 to 10 weeks and be ready to perform at a pretty high level. Anyway, I do agree with that 100%. And I think just being more consistent throughout the year. But you look at Boston Marathon runners, most of them are already consistent. So it would be interesting to see like how different that really was. However, I think, as the authors kind of made the funnel into less training equals faster over the last 4 months, I don't necessarily think that's the case. First of all, my concern is that 4 to 12 months out is 2 months, right? A lot. It's a big chunk of time. And just so a lot can happen. And then 4 weeks is going to be a very specific amount of time. Yeah, it's supposed to be like 16 weeks. That's like one segment, right? Whereas, you could have a few segments in the other. So there's a lot going on there. And if somebody's doing a base period, chances are, yeah, they're just running every day, but they're not doing a lot of intensity, or it's just different types of intensity. And so it might not line up, right? But my bigger issue is that the fact with the cross training, as I alluded to, because I would have liked to have seen that cross training broken up basically into a cardio component versus a strength component, right? Because like if I'm doing core and strength training, mobility, yoga, that should really all be another category. Whereas if I'm spending time on a bike, elliptical, rower, whatever, that's more cardio based. And that's gonna, they're both going to improve your fitness, your general overall fitness, but they're gonna do it in different mechanisms, right? And so I would like to have seen that separate that out, because if somebody's trading an hour run for a 2-hour bike, they're still doing a huge aerobic component to that, and it's not necessarily going to mean that they're training less to do more, right? It just means they've switched what they're doing on 1 day or 2 days, whatever the case may be, but they're still stressing that aerobic system, and that's still going to get plenty of development. So I think I think there's some things that could be, it's a great study, I think, but overall, because I think it just gives some good looks into overall, like if you want to run faster, you want to be a Boston qualifier, you have to be at a certain point, be able to do certain things. And I think that, was showing that in that study is relevant. But however, I do think the way they looked at it was saying like, well, training less frequency. Well, that doesn't mean you're doing less. And that's what focusing on the mileage component of it, that's what I wanted to look at. And even the authors of the kind of the summary that I was reading, they were kind of like, well, that doesn't mean if somebody's doing less runs, that doesn't mean that they're doing less mileage or they're not training for less amount of time, right? Because for one, you might have a marathoner who is doing like a 2 a day of 4 and 4, and now they're just doing 10 miles for their run, right? They've traded those twice a day runs for one longer run. So they're still doing the same amount of mileage, if not more. They're just not doing as many frequently runs. Like they're not doing 14 runs a week. They're doing 10 runs a week or whatever the case is, right? So there could be a lot of stuff going on in there. But really what I want to focus on for the rest of this is kind of just showing you how that might look, right? So you can kind of take this for yourself and kind of think about this as you get into like the last, as you start a marathon segment, right? So if I'm looking at how we coach people and what our usual setup is, it's, something like Monday easy, Tuesday workout, Wednesday off, Thursday workout, Friday, Saturday are easier runs, and then Sunday would be a long run. And that's like if you're following the Hanson's Marathon Method book plans or whatever, right? But that's really kind of the style I've followed as well. So similar setup. Say a person's they want to run 55 miles a week, which is a pretty big clip, but if they're doing it earlier in this segment, then it's going to look different than later in a training segment, right? And so that might, for a 50-mile week, you might have a person run 6 miles on Monday, 8 to 10 miles on Tuesday for their workout, but the workout's going to be faster, so it's going to be shorter. Wednesday off, Thursday some sort of tempo or something like that, which is probably going to be another 8 to 10 miles. Friday might be 6 miles, Saturday might be 6 miles, and then Sunday might be a long run of 14, which is going to put them right around 50 miles a week, maybe a touch over 50 miles a week, right? They're running 6 days a week. There they go. Now, if when they build up and they're in their peak volume, they're going to be something more like 6 on Monday, 12 on Tuesday, Wednesday off, Thursday 14, Friday and 6, Saturday 6 miles, Saturday 10 miles, and Sunday would be 16. Given that, they're going to be 64 miles for the week. And what you notice is that the workouts got bigger, the easy run stayed the same. And then I have on my notes, like they could even take that Friday 6 miler out and have day off so that they would have Wednesday and Friday off, and they'd still run 60 miles a week. So they were running, if they ran 5 days a week, just because their focus of their training has changed, they're going to be running more miles on less days per week, right? So that's where something like that might happen, right? And even still, like even if you wanted to go on beyond that, I have a third example, right? So if you took a person, say they want to run 65 miles for the week, and they do the Tuesday, Thursday workout, and then they even do like a Sunday long run of 20. So at 65-ish, you're right about the point where 20 miles would fit pretty well into our system, especially if you're a more advanced runner. But the point is, out of that 65 miles, you've done 3 workouts that will leave you with a remainder of 19 miles to fill, which we're going to fill with easy days, right? So all I would really have to do is do 8 on Saturday and 8 on Monday, and I'm at right around 65 miles for the week. So again, 5 days a week, but I'm running more volume. And then that gives me 2 more days. I can either recover, I can fill that with, and this is where the cross training thing kind of gets me, because like if it was filled with like a yoga session or stretching or core, whatever, like I'm not adding any more training stress in terms of running, but I'm adding a different stress. I'm focusing on strength and mobility, that sort of thing. And so it could skew the results. You're not doing less, you're just doing different, and you're not doing as much of the running, right? So, or they might just be taking that off. And even if they're taking that off for another day a week, and so they are technically training less frequent, but they're doing more. They're doing plenty more, right? And so that's where I feel like that doesn't necessarily line up. So that's where I would be on that, right? So I think the important part of this is that you recognize, you see a study like that, and it's tough because they even said, oh yeah, if you train less frequency, you're going to run faster. And that's so much different than what we're been told. And it's like, yeah, let's look at that a little bit more, right? Like, is it really different than what we've talked about? Every coach has done forever? No. So you just have to really be careful about that stuff and kind of look into it a little bit more. What are they actually saying there? And I think this is a perfect example, because I would argue, yeah, maybe they are training 1 day less a week, but they're doing more volume and they're doing bigger workouts, right? And that's the giveaway. And it makes sense because, like, again, too, when you look at easy runs, and you can see like the workouts are going up, the easy runs are probably staying the same, maybe increasing a little bit. But the thing is, you could potentially be in a situation where a lot of times you're building your base, and those easy runs are going to have a lot more pertinence into what we're actually doing to build our fitness because they're part of the foundational fitness. But you can do the last 6-8 weeks of a marathon segment. The easy runs aren't necessarily doing that. They're not built for that at that point. They're more for active recovery, just keeping maintenance and things like that. So if they are even a little bit shorter and the workouts are a little bit bigger, it's still going to even out because now your shift is focused from that foundational to the fine tuning, right? We're fine tuning for the race that we're preparing for. So I think it's important to keep that aspect of it in mind too. So given that, I think you just have to take a look at it, everything with a grain of salt, and not take the headlines for what they're trying to say. I think that's an important component to it. And the last thing I was just going to talk about real quick is, so it's like, if I'm looking at that, like, what kind of volume would I really want to be at for a really high level, like a Boston qualifying type of runner? But I'll just give you an example, right? So I have 4 guys who are two 250 or faster. I would say like 238 to 248 would be their range. And then a couple other guys like right at 250, 254, and they're well into their 40s now too. So I think you play that in a role too. But some younger guys that are a little bit faster. But all of those guys are only running. Their training volume for a marathon is anywhere from 60 to 70 miles for the most part. A couple of guys will peak out at like 75, and I have one guy that's peaking out right now he's going to be about 80, 85 miles a week at peak. And he's on the faster side too. He's probably the fastest one in the group. But at that level, because here's the thing, I love volume. I absolutely love volume. I love people running 100-mile weeks. I love going beyond in that. But I also have learned over the last 20 years that it has to be in balance with what the person is doing outside of running, right? And I've been talking about a lot of this before, but this is more in terms of like just balancing everything out as far as like if I have a family, if I have a job, if I'm traveling for that job, all that sort of thing. Like, we don't have an infinite amount of time in our day. So for me, I can get those guys at 70 to 75 miles a week. We can do everything a person would want to do in a marathon training segment. And they're all doing that 6 days a week. If anybody's doing 7 days a week, that seventh run is just a short recovery shakeout run, like in between workouts, right? Just to keep the legs moving, help with the recovery, stuff like that. It's not anything that's, it's 30 minutes, right? It's just a nice little easy shakeout run. But for the most part, they're 6 days a week, 75 miles a week. We can get up to 20, 22 miles a week. For the long run, we're doing 10 plus miles a week in marathon pace. So they'll probably have like a tempo run. Sometimes they have a tempo run and some quality in the long run, and then they'll have their strength workout as well. And we can space that out over the 7 days a little bit different, where we can put more recovery in one week than the next, all that good stuff. But point is, like, that is for me the sweet spot. If you're looking to run really fast, sub 3, 250 and beyond, like if you can get to where you can peak out at 70, 75 miles a week, you can get everything you want to get in, and then you can still recover. And you can do that in 6 days a week. And probably if you really wanted to do is get down to 5 days a week, you could probably do that, right? Because we could just move those 6 milers to 8 milers to 10 milers. Or I have one guy who does 4 in the morning and then 8 at night. Or I would personally flip that around on 8 in the morning and then 4 at night. But you could do it, right? And then that would ultimately give you the freedom to have another day off. So you could do 6. If you were at 7 days a week, you could potentially go to 6. If you were at 6, you could potentially go to 5 and still get that volume in and have 1 or 2 days where you can really fully recover, or you can focus on the strength training on those days, whatever the case is. But I really think like that's what you have to look at. And I think just looking at that study and then reading that article kind of got me thinking on that train, like, well, how can we really maximize this for the regular person who wants to really perform well, is not afraid to train, but we need to make sure that we're keeping everything in balance. And I think that's a good fit for a lot of people. And that's, if you can do 70 miles a week on 5 or 6 days a week, that's significant, right? You're getting plenty fit, and you're still going to get the cumulative fatigue effect for sure, but you're also not going to push it over into the edge of being overtrained too. I think it can really do wonders for you. Now, that's not a call for everybody to go down to 5 days a week by any stretch, but like if things came up and you got an issue, like we could do it. Like it's not a problem. But I think for most people, the 6 days a week works really well at that level. But we can still get to 70 plus miles a week, not an issue. So, but I think that's enough for this week. But I thought that was interesting. Again, if you want to take a look at that study, it was in sports, not the Journal of Sports Medicine, but just Sports Medicine was the name of the journal. And it was in September of 2025, if you want to look into that. With that, we will call it quits for this episode and talk to you guys later. All right, take care. Bye-bye.